Oh, right. So here we go. We are now live. Good afternoon, everyone. We're a little early. We are having a little bugs in our system today. So I'm going to welcome Prof again. Welcome, Prof, to another Live with Prof.
Thank you, Maritza.
I am quickly going to check our Instagram. There we go. Fantastic. Right. So, Prof, I'm just going to share a few things from Nutrition Network.
Good.
So from Nutrition Network, they would like us to remind you of the new addressing silent epidemic of the carnival, where are we now, of the official sugar carbohydrate addiction. It launches on the 28th of May, so make a note of that. They also would like you to remember that your carnivore CBD points are 20 points, and the advanced ethics is free for South African healthcare. So if you are contemplating doing that, it will be very great. It is also will be 15 CBD points that they will be allocating to you. And then addiction training, like I said, it's starting on the 28th of May, and you will have a whopping 30% discount. So just bear all of that in mind. We will share the links with you after our live. So, Prof, anything for us to share?
Yes, indeed. So we've had some exciting news in the last few days. I think we've spoken at length about the research we've been doing over the last 8 years. And for the last 4 years, our team was working on a review, and we wrote a 100 pages review with something like 500 references. And people don't normally publish articles that are that long, but we found the journal and we hoped that we'd be successful. And we found out this week that we have been successful, and the article has been accepted pending a few minor changes. But I just thought I would read you one of the reviewers' comments, because it's not often that you get comments that are as positive as this. And also, this really means the end of the muscle glycogen story. It's finished. And as soon as this article is published, that's it. We can move forward. So the title of the article is Carbohydrate Ingestion on Exercise Metabolism and Physical Performance. And as I said, it looks at essentially all the studies that there have ever been of carbohydrates and exercise, whether you ingest the carbohydrate before or during exercise. So the one reviewer said the authors have meticulously synthesized over a century of scientific literature, drawing from more than 160 studies to challenge long-standing assumptions regarding muscle glycogen as the principal driver of fatigue during prolonged exercise. They instead present compelling evidence for an alternative hypothesis that exercise-induced hypoglycemia, not muscle glycogen depletion, is the primary exercise limiting factor in prolonged endurance exercise. And the reviewer finishes up by saying, this manuscript is a tour de force. It is well researched, expertly argued, and grounded in both classical and contemporary literature. The author's synthesis is not only scientifically rigorous, but also clinically relevant and timely, particularly given the resurgence of interest in low carbohydrate and fat-adapted training strategies. And he finishes up, I found the manuscript to be exceptional in its clarity, depth, and scope. It delivers a meaningful reinterpretation of the role of carbohydrate in endurance performance and calls for a paradigm shift that deserves serious attention from the field. So that's magnificent. So he's identified that there needs to be this paradigm shift from the idea that it's muscle glycogen that's directing exercise performance to know it's liver glycogen that's important because it influences blood glucose levels. So when the article is published, it's going to be very interesting to see what the response will be, but there can only be one response. That's the evidence. We presented 16 lines of evidence supporting that. So 100 pages, 16 lines of evidence, not one or two, 16 lines of different evidence, all pointing the same direction. So for someone to refute it, they're going to have to take on all of those 16 lines of evidence and say this is why they are wrong. So there we go. That's very exciting.
That's absolutely fantastic, Prof. So we're quickly going to jump here onto the comment side. We've got Oscar saying good morning from Los Angeles. Hi, Oscar. We've got Klaus from Brazil. Darkfield Carnival. Loves your work, Prof.
Thank
and
you.
then he just delivered a comment like, yes, well done. Greetings from West Ireland. So it's absolutely fantastic. So for those who are new to the live, please pop your questions in the comments, and then if we have time, we'll get to them. We've got a few that was already pre-booked, and then we see your author already posted one of all. So we're going to start with the ones I got here, and then we're going to jump in between the screens. Right, Prof, this is from Julie. It seems that nearly everyone in our low-carb space is convinced that ketone body levels go down once people are fat adapted. Some people say that urine strips are useless after a few weeks, and some say the blood meters readings will inevitably show lower numbers after a while. This has not been my experience at all. Not in myself, not in people I have worked with, and not by looking at data from studies like the Verta Health one. What have you discovered about this? Thank you so much.
Thanks. I think you covered that very well. Generally, what happens is once you become adapted, you start to burn ketones, so that not only are you producing them, but you're burning more of them to replace carbohydrates. And that will be a possibility that your ketone levels will fall. So it doesn't mean to say that if your ketone levels fall, you're fat adapted. No, it's the opposite. It shows you're more fat adapted because you're burning more fat, but you're just using ketones instead of other things. So I wouldn't get too concerned about it. It doesn't mean you're cheating if your ketone bodies drop. That's a normal response. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it. Everyone's going to be different, and some people will burn more ketones and their ketone levels might drop more or not, and others might drop more. But it's not a good measure of fat adaptation. We use ketones to detect who's cheating on the diet in people who start from high carbohydrate diets and have almost no ketones in their blood or in their urine. And once they change, their ketones will be elevated. And as long as they're elevated above the resting value, we're pretty sure that they're eating a less carbohydrate diet. So you're quite correct that there will be some people who don't show this response, but others will. But I don't think it's particularly important. It doesn't mean that if your ketones are dropping, you're getting out of keto adaptation. The true measure of keto adaptation is how much fat you burn during exercise. And that can only really be measured in different, more complex ways in the laboratory.
Fantastic. Thank you, Prof. So from Arthur here, he says, howdy from Canada. I'm 72. I have been eating a carnivore food plan for 2 years, and I am still 30 pounds overweight. My only non-animal based food is addition of alternative sugar beverages and sometimes some berries. Could these be the culprit, or might I be overeating? I'm not pre-diabetic or with
any other conditions. Thanks, Arthur. That's a real interesting question because a lot of people complain about this, that they lose weight initially and then it stabilizes. And my advice for you would be, if you are concerned about your weight, you should drop the sugar beverages and consider the berries as well. But I think there's a lot of interest now in increasing your protein intake and reducing your fat consumption. So we initially focused on cutting carbohydrates, but there's quite a lot of evidence that for some people, increasing the protein content is what is extremely satiating. So you see, when you say, are you overeating, that means that you're taking in more calories than your body needs. And initially, that's always because the diet that you're eating, it doesn't satiate you. And so as a result, you eat too many calories. But it's rather more complex than that. And I would advise that you just eat more protein. And if you increase your protein intake and you cut all the carbs, you'll get to the weight that your body will allow you to get at. Otherwise, you have to start starving, and I'm not sure that that's a good idea. So just try that. Try to increase your protein intake and reduce your fat intake. You might find that your fat intake is a lot higher than you think it is, and conversely, your protein intake is a lot lower than you think it is. It's very difficult to eat lots of protein without getting fat with it, because most high protein diets, foods, have lots of fat with them. So you have to be very cautious in choosing to get more protein. But that would be my solution. It's worked for a lot of people. If it only works partially, it's because your body is saying, actually, this is the weight I want you to be at. And as long as you've got no other evidence for metabolic syndrome, then I wouldn't be too concerned. If your weight is, you still think it's a bit too high. Your health may be fine, even though you think your weight's a bit too high.
Fantastic. Thank you, Prof. So we've got one here on the other line that goes, my name is Jason, and I am 49 years old, single dad, emailing to ask what I should eat as a natural bodybuilder who lifts weights 3 times a week. Also, what should my 16-year-old son eat as it helps plays basketball a few times a week and strength training with barbells twice a week?
Okay, well, what we've kind of shown and what I read out earlier is that you don't need carbohydrates to perform exercise. So therefore, you also don't need carbohydrates to build your body. What you need is protein and fat. So I would just increase the protein and fat consumption, and coming from real foods like animal proteins and animal fats, and see what happens, and cut out the junk, the highly processed foods that are full of carbohydrates and full of sugar. What you want to do is make sure your children don't get sugar addicted. And that's key to the whole messaging for me. So increase the protein, increase the fat, and reduce the carbohydrates, and that will cover all your requirements for all your family and for your children.
Fantastic. Thank you, Prof. So the next one is from Klaus. He goes, Prof, some professionals believe that casein protein is bad for us. Could you explain a bit about what is casein and why do people believe it is harmful?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that evidence. As far as I know, casein is a milk protein, but again, I haven't looked it up for some time, and my nutrition research focuses. It's interesting, as I was driving here, because I'm revising Law of Running, and it turns out that in Law of Running, there's this much section on protein and this much section on fat and carbohydrate. I realized, protein has never been a big issue for me and for the runners, because firstly, we said you've got to eat lots of carbs, and now we're saying you eat lots of fat. Now we've forgotten about the protein. So I'm an absolute non-expert on protein. And I think there is very good evidence that many of us eat too little protein. So I don't know that there's evidence that casein is damaging for health. And so I'm just ignorant about that. Maybe you could check on Google. People feel worried about Google, but I'm astonished by it. And AI. So the beauty of rewriting Law of Running for the 100th time or the 5th time is that you can now access the internet, and if you search for an article, it gives you all the most recent articles which are in the same area. And one's able to access the information so much better. So I think that if you looked at casein or dangers of casein, you'll definitely get the information on why people say it's bad or why it's good. And the interesting thing is, if you put in for political stuff, you always get a biased answer depending on which source you're looking for. But in biology, it seems to me that they don't have that. You'll get what is available, and hopefully some of it will be the truth. So I'm not aware that casein is dangerous. And if you want to eat more protein, the creatine is the big one at the moment. Everyone's focusing on creatine. And people are saying that 5 grams of creatine added to your diet has enormous benefits, including for your brain. So if you want to eat increased protein, supplement your protein, try creatine. It may well be the solution for you.
Fantastic. So, Prof, how's the book going? Before Karen asks.
Yeah, no, it's going very well. Thank you. It's been epic because, see, my problem was that I last wrote the book, 2002 was the last edition. And then I was interested in, then I wrote Waterlogged in 2012, which was all about heat and water and hyponatremia. So that was the focus. And then in 2014, when we published The Real Meal Revolution, suddenly I had to defend myself in court against the claims that this was dangerous information. So then I had to gear up on nutrition and become a little bit more knowledgeable on health nutrition. And that took me through to 2018 when the trial ended. And that's when we started doing the carbohydrate research. And so I've only been focused back on the carbohydrates and exercise physiology since 2018, which means there was a gap for 16 years. And I was literally scared that I wouldn't be able to catch up that information. But it's gone exceptionally well. And I'm now very happy that I'm right on top of it again, as I was when I wrote 2002 edition. So now I'm going to blaspheme. And excuse me, please, but take this in the way it's meant. People said the Law of Running version 4 is the Bible. And I mean, I've read that many places. So but that's the Old Testament. What you're going to get with Law of 5 is the New Testament. Still the Bible, but it's the New Testament.
Fantastic, Prof. So we've got another question on my side here. So I'm a 22-year-old male. This question comes from Alton. Training for half Ironman distance and struggling heavily with going back and forth on eating high fat, low carb / carnivore. And then the mainstream media talking about eating glucose and carbohydrates to fuel myself constantly. I would really love to have more information or clarity from your side into my life choices regarding eating constant or going back and forth in this horrible cycle. Eating carnivore for a week or 2 weeks, then binging out. I ultimately want to eat the carnivore because I feel great for many reasons, but would like to know how to stop the binging.
Okay. The binging is the addiction, is the carbohydrate sugar addiction and ultra-processed food addiction. And I think that's one of the problems with many of the athletes who promote this diet and say it's a healthy diet, because I don't think it is, but I allow them to have their opinion. The problem is it's the addiction. And what you're doing is you're binging, as you said, you're going off for 2 weeks, and then the desire to go back catches in. And one of the keys about addictions is that you mustn't go back to the environment where the addictive behavior happens. So if you're an alcoholic, the last place you go to is the pub, because that just recreates the addictions again. And so what you have to do is you have to say, okay, where am I being stimulated to eat carbs and sugar? Where is that happening? If it's happening with your friends who are doing it, well, you have to leave them for the time being until you've been clean for 6 months or so. Once you've been carnivore for a long enough time, you'll find that it's very easy to look at the carbs and not even be interested. But it takes time. And every time you break it, it just delays it for longer. So my advice to you is that I've seen enough evidence that you don't need carbohydrates to perform optimally, even in the Ironman triathlon. And I advised Dave Scott, who was the greatest Ironman triathlete of the 1970s and the 80s. In fact, the event exists because of him. Without him, it would never have become as popular as it is. And when he read Real Meal Revolution, he wrote to me and he said, Tim, I wish I'd followed this diet 30 or 40 years ago when I was winning the Ironman. Winning. Remember, he won it 6 times. He said, I would have gone 40 minutes faster. So you ever want one person to convince you that the Ironman can be done on a high-fat diet, that's him. Then, of course, the greatest triathlete of all time is a South African, ex-South African and Zimbabwean, Paula Newby-Fraser. She won the Ironman in Hawaii 8 times, and she won 26 Ironman competitions in her career, which was very long, as you can see. And I advised her incorrectly at the time because she misinterpreted what I said. She asked me, should I put more fat in my diet? I said, yes, Paul, that's a good idea. So she cut all the carbs and she went low carbs. But I didn't say she'd go low carbs because I was advising people to eat high carb diets. But I thought, well, if she's doing the Ironman, she can maybe eat a little more fat. And she went the whole way and ate a lot more fat and became the greatest triathlete of all time. So that's a very interesting anecdote. And part of the problem, they say, oh, but there's no world-class athletes currently eating the high-fat diet. And we don't know because there's no analysis of it done. And I think these guys won't, even if they were, they wouldn't acknowledge it because there's so much pressure on them. And I definitely know that if you're cycling for one of the leading teams in the Tour de France, you may not eat fat. You have to eat carbohydrate. Because a South African who I was helping, advising, he was eating a high-fat diet and he suddenly rose to a level where he was competitive. And he got into one of the professional teams. I'm not sure it was in the Tour de France. And he said they wouldn't allow him to eat his normal diet. He had to go high carbs. And that's because the doctors on the teams have a strong affiliation to carbs. They're probably funded, some of the teams are probably funded by carbs, by the manufacturers' carbs. And they absolutely cannot say that you can eat a high-fat diet and still do well. That would be suicide for their careers. They'd never be appointed to another team in the cycling world if they said that. So that's why industry has got a complete control of the messaging. And what we try to do is say, well, listen, here's the evidence that we're presenting. And I spoke up about the paper that we've just written. And again, it's 16 lines of evidence why you don't need muscle glycogen to perform optimally. But you do need a little glucose during exercise, but that's only 10 grams per hour. So I would advise you to make a resolution that you're going to get rid of your addiction. And it's very difficult, and the Noakes Foundation and Nutrition Network run courses on how you stop addiction. And we've got some of the world's best people like Bitten Johnson, who's just amazing. And she taught me so much because she had her own addictive problems and she worked out how you resolve them. And the reason why she's so different is she realized the brain changes as part of the addictive process. And you have to change the brain back to where it was before you became addicted. And if you don't address the brain component, you don't get over it. I was fortunate that my sugar addiction wasn't too bad. And I started feeling so much better on the high-carb diet, the high-fat diet. I started feeling so much better on the high-fat diet that it was simple. I thought, my gosh, if this is working, I don't ever want to see sugar again. So I had a reason for stopping the sugar. And it was quite easy. But I think it's because also, very important point, my mother grew up in a family that ate lots of meat. And she would have eaten meat during the pregnancy with me. And I wasn't weaned onto high carbohydrates. I was weaned onto meat and other sources of protein and not onto sugar. Because I grew up in Zimbabwe in 1949 and processed foods I don't think was there. We ate straight from the farm. And so I suspect that's one of the reasons why I could drop the sugar addiction quite easily. My sugar addiction only started when I started running and started eating all these carbs. Yeah, so I understand why it's difficult, but it's so worth it. You'll realize once you can do it.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Prof. So remember, Nutrition Network's addiction training starts on the 28th of May. So we will put the link in our chats later. So hi, Wendy. Wendy is back. We love Wendy. She's here every time.
Wendy.
She's got a question. I like to be ultimately ultimately lean as a carnivore athlete, a master swimmer? Suggestions. Can one eat so much fat? If so, is excess fat consumed excretely or stored? I am only one on a team of 250 eating this way and thriving. I'm extremely grateful to you, Prof, for your brilliant research, dedication, kindness, and outreach. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Wendy, well, thank you so much for those kind words. I appreciate it. All the way from Canada, good luck to you guys. I gather you're having an election, and I haven't seen what the results are, but I hope whatever you hope for that election, that it comes true. Okay, yes, you can definitely eat too much fat, and it's not, you do store it. So you can overeat on fat, and you will store it as adipose tissue. So that's one of the problems. So for many of us, I find fat extremely satiating. And so it's more difficult for me to overeat on fat, but it's not impossible. So that's a key point. And other people find it more difficult, and they continue to overeat on fat. And they then have to increase their protein intake, and that's the way to do it. But as I've indicated, protein is the forgotten substrate in exercise physiology, except if you're a weightlifter. They've always understood the value of protein. But marathon runners and Ironman triathletes, we don't understand the value of protein because we cut it from the diet when we replace it all with carbohydrates. And now, in a sense, as we've come along with the high-fat diet, we've kind of forgotten protein again. We said, well, just don't eat the carbs, just fill up on protein, fill up on fat. And so we've forgotten the protein. And what I'm going to have to do is to go home today and start rewriting the section on protein and start researching it more thoroughly. And I apologize but I think that's how things are. And protein is now the forgotten fuel, and we need to go back and focus on it more.
Fantastic. So I see Val here wrote, congratulations on all the work that went into the article and the acceptance. And
thanks, Val. That's very kind of you. Yes. You know, that was a monumental piece of work. And I must say, I'm really excited because one of my great friends, when he saw I was interested in that, he said, well, you must send me the material and I'm going to turn it into a book. So eventually we're going to be able to, and the goal will be, okay, so do you need carbohydrates during exercise? No, and here's the evidence. I do address it at great length in Law of Running, but it does need something more than Law of Running to get the message out completely.
An appendix on the New Testament. So Val also had a question, Prof. She went, I have been following the low-carb diet, RMR guidelines since 2016, and I am calm 99%. I would rather not eat than put something off plan into my mouth. My latest TG was 0.94, HDL was 2.86,
wow.
LDL was 7.07, total of 10.36. Are they still are all steadily increasing above normal parameters? BMI 23.8. I have simply ignored the raised levels until. Sorry, I'm just going to find the rest of it. Oh, until now. Yeah. How does one ascertain what is actually driven parameters up to address the actual cause and not have it simply being put to the genetics by the GP? Most not having understanding of low-carb lifestyle. I want to place you on statins.
Okay, you raise some really interesting question that's currently boiling over on Twitter. So I'll start and then I'll give you the latest picture from Twitter. So as you read out those results, I said, amazing. Your HDL is astonishing. And the ratio that you want is your HDL to triglycerides, and your value is in the stratosphere, and that is good. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard someone with such a high HDL. And the triglycerides could be lower, but they're still way below the normal. So if we were looking at insulin resistance in you, we'd say you absolutely don't have insulin resistance. And I would expect that your glucose levels at rest, fasting, your insulin levels will be extremely low. So I would suggest that you don't have insulin resistance. Now, why is that important? Because the most important cause of coronary artery disease that we know is diabetes and insulin resistance. And so therefore, technically, you should be, or we should be able to predict that you are at incredibly low risk of coronary artery disease. And I think what I immediately at this point, I would suggest that you go and have your coronary artery calcium score measured, because I suspect it will show the value is very low, i.e. 0 or below 50. And what that tells you is that your risk for coronary artery disease is extremely low for the rest of your life. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get some coronary artery narrowing. That's sort of inevitable. But it does mean that it's unlikely ever to obstruct and cause you heart attacks and other problems. So that would, if you were to do that, we could stop the discussion. Okay. Because now I have to bring in the complications. And the complication is that there is a small group of people like yourself and like myself, and we are called the lean body mass hyperresponders. And when we take a high fat diet, our cholesterol shoots up like yours does to over 7 units. And when the doctor sees you, they become cataplectic and want to put you on statins. But I might just add that in women, a value of 7 is what used to be considered ideal. And there are studies showing that in women, a value of 7 is ideal. But let's again just ignore that. Okay, so most people eating this diet do not push their cholesterol levels up, but there's a small group who do, and you're one of them. Now, there currently is a study ongoing of this, of people who, like you and me, have high cholesterols and were lean. And what they did was they took a group of 100 of these people and they followed them for a year. And most of the cholesterols are the value of 9 or so. And this is where the problems arose, because unexpectedly, they found that some of those people eating the carnivore diet had quite a high rate of coronary artery plaque formation. And now there's the whole debate. Now what you see is all the people who are standing up against this diet are saying, you see, you're killing me because my plaque is forming. The argument is that there are actually very few studies of normal people for plaque progression in normal people. You know, everyone thinks, well, I'm not getting plaque progression. It's impossible. And then a study like this shows that actually there is plaque progression even in people who are pretty healthy. And so what happened was that the paper was published in preprint form, and it was immediately picked up by a group of scientists who took the data and rewrote it and published it as a different argument. So here's the one group who published the original data said, yes, there is a bit of progression, but it's not saying nothing to be worried about. This group has taken it and says, you see, there's this massive progression in people eating the carnivore diet, and it's a risk for everyone. And that's not true, because it's a subset of people eating the carnivore diet who have high cholesterol. And in the initial analysis, they said that the progression is unrelated to blood cholesterol concentrations or the other cholesterol, the ApoB fraction. And I looked at the data, and if you had a value of ApoB, whether it was low or high, it couldn't tell you whether you're going to get progression or not. And so to me, this is more of the same problem. It's associational data. And they've found an association between the people on the diet and their cholesterol or the ApoB and faster progression. And that doesn't mean that it's the cholesterol or the ApoB. And my interpretation is that this is an incredibly important study, because the reason why your doctor tells you need statins is because no one has ever studied the alternative, developed an alternative hypothesis. So remember what we were thanked for developing the alternate hypothesis on carbohydrates. Because statins have been so dominant, every cardiologist in the world says you have to take statins because it's going to cure your disease. But there's no data to support that. And what has happened is no one has come along and said, okay, what about an alternate hypothesis? What about diabetes? Or what about stress? What about inflammation? And all these other things. They just ignored. And the National Institute of Health, because it's controlled until Kennedy came along a few months ago, it was controlled by the pharmaceutical industry, they never funded studies to look at what's really causing coronary artery disease. So the immediate question from this study is not that some people advanced rapidly, it's why did they advance rapidly? What was unique about them? And it's not going to be the diet, and it's not going to be the cholesterol, in my opinion. It's going to be something else that has been missed. And it'll be inflammation and clotting. That's what it'll be. And now finally, we've got a population who've got a high cholesterol, and some of them will have clotting and some of them won't. And my prediction is the ones with clotting will have the more advanced rapid progression, and those who don't have clotting won't. And that'll be fabulous, because now we can say, okay, we must research the clotting mechanisms to prevent coronary artery disease. Not worrying about the cholesterol. It's just something that's misleading us, and it's misled us for 50 years. So I'm very positive about this. The problem is you're going to get now even more focus saying your cholesterol's too high and you've got to bring it down. The problem is, fortunately not in your case, but for some of us like myself, because I'm pre-diabetic, if I'm told I must now reduce my cholesterol, I must go back to the high carb diet. Well, I'm just going to die of diabetes. That's all that's going to happen. So for some of us, we're really caught in a cleft stick. We don't, which way do we go? And you have to make the decision for yourself. And I choose to think that diabetes is the bigger problem, and inflammation. And it's not the cholesterol. Incidentally, just as a final point, the reason why your cholesterol goes up in this small population, I want to make the point, it is a small population. My great friend David Unwin, who pushes the low-carb diet in Britain and has done so much and deserves a Nobel Prize one day, but he's not going to get it because he's not in academics and he's a general practitioner. How can a general practitioner win a Nobel Prize? But he's the one who's reversed diabetes in something like 150 people in his practice. Astonishing, and they didn't go and have to do other things. He just taught them the dietary reversal. He said he's only got 2 or 3 people in his practice who've got this problem. So he's got a lot of people with diabetes, and he's got a lot of people on the high fat diet, but he's only got 3 or so, I can't remember the 3 is the exact number, who've got this low body mass hyper response. So it's a small subgroup, and we can't tarnish the carnivore diet for everyone just because a few people have shown this mechanism. But to come back to the point I was making for you, if you were to change your diet, you would be fine. In other words, if you were to increase your carbohydrate intake, you'd probably be fine because you're not very insulin resistant. And so you could cope with more carbohydrates. Your glucose would go up a bit, your insulin would go up a bit, you'd put on a little weight, but you'd probably be fine. You wouldn't get arterial disease because you're not unlikely to get diabetes in the long term. But my suggestion is the only reason you should change, you might consider changing, not you have to, you might consider, is if you have a scan of your heart and it shows that you've got advanced, in other words, you've got a high coronary artery calcium score. If you've got a high coronary artery calcium score, then you might want to consider changing. But even then, I would probably suggest, again, I'm not a medical doctor any longer, I would look at the clotting mechanisms. And again, also, do you have a family history? If you have a family history, that may well be the clotting problems. So that's my advice. It's a long story, but you raise some very interesting issues which are right at the front of the debate at the moment. And you're going to see a lot of negative information about the carnivore diet coming out, when what the focus should be, it should be the negatives, that the science hasn't progressed for 50 years. And people don't actually know what's causing coronary artery narrowing. It's not cholesterol. But because everyone's convinced it's cholesterol, they haven't done the research for alternative hypotheses. And that's what these guys are doing, to their great credit, because they always ran the risk that they'd find that the diet made things worse. And they still did it. And that took a lot of courage.
Fantastic. Thanks, Prof. What a mouthful. So I'm just going to run through all these lovely comments. Saif here is watching Carnival followers from Saudi. Hi, Saif. And then Annette here says, thanks for all that you do, Prof.
Pleasure.
And then Katie is from West Virginia, USA. That sounds fun. Andre asked, he's in Langebaan. He missed where the article is going to be published, Prof.
Yeah, Andre, it's in the journal Endocrine Reviews, which I'm glad to say is one of the top journals that has a very high impact factor. So the article will be well read and it'll be widely cited in the literature.
Fantastic. Andre also had a question, Prof. He says, I'm busy reading about intermittent fasting and there seems to be a lot of benefits. I'm following a low carb, no sugar diet and have lost 22 kilos in the past 3.5 months. He was also part of our EPSA program. Prof, he did really well.
Yeah, Andre, congratulations. That's amazing.
So maybe Prof can give him some more information regarding intermittent fasting.
Yeah, I think intermittent fasting is really good. And because I think we eat too frequently, and there's really good evidence that intermittent fasting is helpful. Jason Fung is the world authority, and I would follow him and perhaps read his books and follow his blogs. And then you'll get the evidence. But I mean, you've seen the evidence in yourself. There's no risk with intermittent fasting. I'm still unsure that fasting for 4 or 5 days is necessary or beneficial. But intermittent fasting, which means that you eat only for a short period every day, that's very, very healthy.
Fantastic. And then Granny is all the way from Gauteng. Hello, Granny. Mofana asked if a Prof can touch anything on menopause.
I was asked that the other day in private, and I said, I'm not the expert on that. And my bias is to think that menopause is a normal phenomenon, and it should be treated as a normal phenomenon. And once you start drugging it, using drugs to prevent the menopause, so-called, I'm not sure that that's such a good idea. But again, I might be wrong. Some people might say that your bone density is better if you use drugs and so on. But I'm terribly suspicious of the pharmaceutical trials, pharmaceutically industry-funded trials, because they always over-promote the findings and under-promote the negative consequences. And I just think humans evolved for menopause for a reason. There was a reason. One of the reasons was so we could have lots of grandmothers, so that they weren't producing babies all the time, so they could start looking after the children. So that's one of the reasons why women have a menopause. And I think it's a normal phenomenon. And I would just be reluctant to meddle with it. Both my mother-in-law and my wife went through the menopause without any problems, and neither used any medication.
Oh, fantastic. Tian Sputa is on statins now for 30 years, following keto and want to stop taking it, but the doctors for statins other 10 doctors for the statins, other 10 say statins no good. I have inherited cholesterol, was told that at 30 years ago. I am now 55.
Well, Tiens, the great news is that if you have so-called inherited cholesterol, it either kills you before you're 50 or you have a normal life expectancy. And the doctors don't know that, but that's what the data shows. And the end result is that a person of your age will have a very good life expectancy because you won't get some of the other diseases like cancer. They never tell you that. But if you've got so-called genetic hypercholesterolemia, your risk of cancer goes down. So if you're born with inherited cholesterol, so-called, there's increased death rate before about 50, but that's offset by the other group who don't have that component of the disease, and they live longer because they don't have cancers. So the end result is that the life expectancy of people with elevated cholesterol on a genetic basis is normal. That doesn't mean to say everyone lives longer, unfortunately. And the theory I'll suggest is that in the people with so-called inherited cholesterol who die before the age of 50, they have two things. By chance, they happen to have a high cholesterol, and that gets blamed, but that's not the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem is clotting. There's a clotting defect. And so their blood is more likely to clot, and they're more likely to damage their arteries and die as a consequence. And so if you're over 55 and you're statin, and you've told you need statins again, for your benefit, I would say you also would benefit from a coronary artery calcium score. And if it's low, then that tells you that your high cholesterol hasn't damaged your arteries in any unusual way. And so the statins are not going to help, because incidentally, the statins don't help in genetic hypercholesterolemia. There's every evidence. When people look at plaque, the plaque, which is supposedly causing the artery problems, in people with genetic hypercholesterolemia, whether they're on statins or not, doesn't change the rate at which plaque develops. But no one tells you that. They just assume, oh, well, the cholesterol's there. If we keep it lower, you're not going to get the plaque. But that's simply not true, because something else is causing the problem.
Thanks, Prof. Sandy here said, I've recently gone back to prioritizing protein and healthy fats in my diet and can manage it for about 4 days. But then the carb craving hits hard. I'd love some suggestions on how to deal with them. I had a gastric sleeve nearly 10 years ago, but have regained most of the weight. Apparently, I have insulin resistance and would like to reverse that and become lean and healthy.
Okay, Sandy, that's brilliant, because you've got quite a few issues to face and you're keen to face them. I would suggest that you have insulin resistance and that you've got to get your carbs down low and keep them low. And as we've discussed, you do that by increasing the fat and increase the protein intake. But for some people, it's much better to increase the protein more than the fat. And you'll need to decide whether you're one of those people or not. Sorry, can you just call it back again? Yeah. So that's what you need to do. With regard to the first issue is you need to stay on the diet for life. The second issue is that you have an addiction, like many of us, and addictions, you can't have a bit of an addiction. It's either 100% or it's nothing. And you've got to find a way to get your addiction to zero. And we run the programs on the Noakes Nutrition Network, run the programs for you. You need to understand that your brain has changed as a consequence of the addiction. And just like an alcoholic or a person smoking, you've got to change the brain to get rid of the addiction for life. You often can't do it by yourself, you need help. And the one program is the 12 steps program that you use to get rid of the addictions. I would suggest that you need to go the whole hog. You've got to need help. You need professional help to get you over your food addiction. And it's not going to happen just by yourself. And the answer is the benefit for you will be so huge that it's really worth doing. And I'd like suggest that what you need to do is you need to see yourself as you want to be. And then you say, right, that's what I'm going to achieve, and this is how I'm going to do it. And I believe I can do it. And I'm going to get so much better as a reason. And you must picture yourself as you want to be in the future and then work on it. But you have to believe it's possible. And these people that we work with will make it possible for you. So to be successful, you have to have the belief to start everything.
Fantastic. Now I'm going to scroll.
Okay. Sorry.
I see Oscar asked us in increment questions here. So I'm going to read from here. Water and electrolytes with creatine in bottles. I do not eat carbs most of the days, but some days I do a gummy bear at the beginning to take a couple of gummy bears, and then every 20 minutes. And then the next part of his question, take another one just to keep the sweet flavor in my mouth. That seems to help me a lot from the mental point. Now my question is to you. There we go. Almost 1.5 years will help need to increase or not. I'm not sure, Prof. Almost, yeah. So
then he says, I was.
Oh, yes, there's another part. I was a sugar addict and I have many cavities. Cavities?
Yeah, right. Teeth cavities.
To prove it, but I'm quite to sugar and carbs in general, and my health has improved tremendously. I quit.
Yeah, Oscar, that's right. So you have quit, and that's good, but you're still sitting on the edge. So I would not eat those gummy bears because they are just encouraging you to continue. And you said it's 1.5 years. Well, you're still on the edge. You really have to get rid of the gummy bears and go full on absence of sugar. That's the only way to treat the addiction.
Fantastic. Thanks, Prof. Amanda says, good morning from Canada. And then Pinky made a comment here. The only time I got hypoglycemia was when I took just a bit of a zero carb drink in a race. I think it was because now I'm too insulin sensitive to the sweet taste.
Yeah, Pinky. Now, I think what you're describing there is a real problem. So insulin is a real cause of hypoglycemia. So the group that's most at risk of developing hypoglycemia are diabetics, type 2 diabetics who need insulin, type 1 diabetics who need insulin, apologies, so they don't produce the insulin themselves. And they inject insulin. And if they eating lots of carbs, they get this bouncing, and the blood glucose is never like that. It's always bouncing up and down because they tend to over-inject. So when the glucose goes up, they tend to over-inject insulin and that drops it. And they get hypoglycemia. And what's found is if you take a type 1 diabetic who produces no insulin and you put them on the low carb diet, they stop these deep drops and the hypoglycemia. Now, the same can happen in certain people who are not diabetic, that they take carbohydrates before exercise and they start exercise 30 minutes later when their insulin is still elevated. Insulin completely blocks their fat metabolism. And as a result, they just burn carbs and they can become hypoglycemic very quickly, within 30 minutes or so. So I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to. Could it happen during exercise that you took the carbs? Generally, it's less likely because you don't secrete insulin to the same extent during exercise as before exercise. So in other words, if you take lots of carbs during exercise, the insulin response is much less than if you took lots of carbs before exercise. So I think that your point is that you should avoid carbs because you found it's not working for you. With the exception, you can take a little bit of carbohydrate, 10 grams per hour is what we suggest. And that will prevent you ever running out of glucose during prolonged exercise.
Fantastic. Thanks, Prof. Jorlindo says, Dear Prof, I am a marathoner and I run in a keto way. I eat only a banana before hard training and half a gel with NCT every 5 kilometers during marathon. Do you think this is okay?
Yeah, Jolanda, that's fine because you're not loading up too much on carbs. But I don't think you need it all. You know, probably you need one gel, half a gel. Oh, sorry, you did say during the marathon. So half a gel, as far as I know, would be about 10 to 12 grams. And we say that's what you need every hour. So if you're running a 4-hour marathon, then you could need 4 half gels. And that would be more than enough to keep you going. I wouldn't eat the bananas before hard training because it's not necessary. And it only sort of keeps you thinking that carbs are essential. So what I've suggested, if you're running a 4-hour marathon, you could take 4 half gels, 1 every hour for the 4 hours, and that's all you need. So you just need 2 gels for the whole distance.
Thank you, Prof. Maria van Niekerk says, good afternoon from Abu Dhabi. Nick says, good morning, Prof, from Georgia, USA. Love your work, Prof. Keep up the superb things you do. TDM, 34 years, lost 62 pounds of 30 years of meds. AIC 5.0.
So brilliant, Nick. That's fantastic. Well done. It's just amazing to hear so many people doing so well, and you just well done. I mean, it's just amazing. I wonder, Nick, why you started on the diet 34 years ago, because you were way ahead of everyone else. Because 34 years ago, and no one was talking low-carb diets. Not many people were anyway. So you did well done. I think Atkins was actually around at that time. So perhaps Atkins in New York influenced you. I see you're from Georgia. So maybe that influenced your choices. Well done.
So we're going to do one more, Prof.
Okay.
So Vivian, in the recent podcast, a nutrition scientist said that she is anti-keto with both sexes because when they look at the gut microbiome, they see a decrease in diversity. She said that if one looks at the ketogenic diet and the high fat intake that comes with it, it significantly decreases that gut microbiome digestive diversity, which reduces the body's ability to synthesize vitamins and to produce serotonin. I'm pro-keto and carnivore. What is the best way to answer people who say that keto is a negative effect?
I think the best answer is to leave the room. You're dealing with a religion, and that's the problem. So to answer you simply, that dietitian, they have to have a hate for keto because it takes patients away from them, because all they know is the high carbohydrate diet, and they've got this rote education. And if you ever look at the diets that they offer you, they're exactly the same. It doesn't matter what disease you have, it's all the same. And it's all high carbohydrates. And so we know that doesn't work for diabetes and for insulin resistance. But do you think you can get them to change? No, it's impossible. And it's impossible because if they speak out against carbohydrates, they'll lose everything that they have. You know, I think people don't understand the influence that industry has on practicing doctors and practicing dietitians. But if you step out of line, you're really risking everything. And so that it's just not worth doing it. If you'd much rather keep saying the same stuff and still earn your income, be able to send your children to school, etc., than risk everything. Because what do you do if you choose something different and start talking differently? What are you going to do? You're not going to have any patience. So that's the problem. You have to understand it. That's why you're not going to convert those people. It's impossible. It's the vegetarians are the same, and I understand why some vegetarians follow the diet because they believe it's humane, etc., and that's perfectly fine. But that's not a reason why you should be eating that particular diet. You've got to look at what the diet does for you, and then we'll see what happens. Now, let's take this specific example. The microbiome is made up of trillions of bacteria, trillions. And they believe they can sample it and tell you what bacterial diversity you've got. It is nonsensical because they're not studying enough of the sample to know exactly what's happened. So what happens next is that the people who do microbiome research come from either the high fat or the high carb group. If they're the high fat diet, sorry, let's start with the high carb diet, they'll say, oh, you see, this is the microbiome. That is fantastic. This is the healthy microbiome because we know high carbohydrate diets are good. So this is good. Whatever we find in the gut, that's good. Conversely, they then look at the diet on people who are eating a high-fat diet. They say, oh, you see, high-fat diets are bad for you. And look what we're seeing here. This is terrible. And there's absolutely no randomized controlled trials showing that if your microbiome is one way or the other, that it impacts on your long-term health, which is what you have to do. And unfortunately, it's never going to happen because those studies have to last 40 years and you have to get people to eat for 40 years, either a high-carb diet or a high-fat diet, and then you've got to do the microbiome studies. So anyone who's a scientist immediately knows that this is not true. It may be true, but it's impossible to prove. And so that is not a single reason why you say the keto diet's wrong. You have to look at everything. You have to look at all the effects. And I'm sorry that the evidence for the keto diet is what we summarize in our textbook, the keto textbook. And there we had the 60 top people in the world. And when you read that is the most complete analysis of the keto diet. And it looks at everything, not just microbiome, but everything. And you can read that book and then decide for yourself, or she should read the diet book and decide for herself, but she won't because her mind is closed for the reason that I spoke about. So again, just to make the point, I wouldn't bother but what I can confirm to you is that the keto diet is the most studied diet in the world. And it's also got the most benefits in the world. There's nothing that comes close. So that's the evidence when you look at the totality of the evidence. And you can't go and pick these things. And I've tried to indicate to you that's the weakest evidence because we don't know how you sample the microbiome. You know, it's interesting in science, things come along and then they disappear. And for a period, everything is microbiome, microbiome, microbiome. And then all of a sudden it sort of tails off and then it disappears again. And so unless someone can come along and say, by changing the microbiome, I reversed diabetes, coronary artery disease, blah, blah, blah. And that's because these particular bacteria increased and those bacteria decreased. It's all speculation. It's not proven evidence.
Fantastic. Prof, we are now over our time. I would like to say thank you. Again, thank you to our viewers. For those whose questions and comments we didn't get to, we will put it on our little list, and please feel free to leave another comment if you want. Prof, from our side, thank you very much for being here. And we'll see you on the flip side. Just remember, just a recap, carnivore course, CBD points, and of course, the ethics is also free for healthcare workers in South Africa from Nutrition Network. The addiction training, everybody that loves their carbs, 28th of May it starts. There's a 30% discount currently. And also the keto course has got a birthday sale of 30%. Once again, thank you so much, Prof. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Melissa. Bye-bye.